Good evening. Tonight, we descend into the blood-soaked sands of Troy, where the screams of dying warriors echo across 3 millennia, where the clash of bronze against bronze reverberates through the halls of eternity, and where the most devastating war in human mythology was nothing more than a cosmic joke played by bored and vindictive gods. This is not a tale of heroic glory or noble sacrifice. This is the story of how divine vanity, petty jealousies, and celestial egos turned the ancient world into a charnel house, where mortals were mere pawns in an immortal game of chess, and where the price of godly entertainment was paid in rivers of human blood. Before we dive into this tale of pride, blood, and divine chaos, tell me in the comments which country you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. Imagine, we are all gathered like ancient bards, sharing this story under the same stars, while the ghosts of Troy whisper their warnings across the centuries. The Trojan War, 10 years of slaughter, thousands of deaths, entire bloodlines extinguished, cities reduced to ash, and for what? A woman's face, a matter of honor, the pursuit of glory. No, the truth is far more disturbing, far more pathetic, and far more terrifying than any mortal cause could ever be. The Trojan War was orchestrated, manipulated, and prolonged by the gods themselves, beings of immense power who treated human lives like pieces on a board game, who reveled in the suffering they created, and who turned the Mediterranean into a theater of divine sadism. This is the story of how Olympus went to war with itself, using mortal flesh as ammunition. Our tale begins not with the clash of armies, not with the launching of ships, but with something far more mundane and infinitely more dangerous: a wedding party. The marriage of Peleus and Thetis, a mortal king and a sea nymph, should have been a joyous occasion. All the gods were invited to celebrate, to feast, to toast the happy couple. All except one. Eris, the goddess of discord, strife, and chaos, had been deliberately excluded from the guest list. Perhaps the other gods thought her presence would spoil the festivities. Perhaps they believed that a goddess whose very nature was to sow conflict had no place at a celebration of love. They were about to learn that excluding the goddess of discord was like trying to keep fire away from dry wood. It was not a matter of if it would catch, but when. Eris arrived uninvited, her eyes blazing with the fury of rejection, her heart burning with the need for revenge. She could have unleashed her wrath directly, could have turned the wedding into a bloodbath, could have sent the gods into immediate conflict. Instead, she chose something far more elegant, far more devastating, and far more characteristic of divine cruelty. She chose to plant a seed that would grow into a tree of suffering for generations. Into the midst of the celebration, she hurled a golden apple. Not just any apple, but one inscribed with 3 simple words that would echo through eternity: to the fairest. Then she vanished, leaving behind only the apple and the poison of its promise. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. 3 goddesses, each supreme in her own domain, each proud beyond mortal comprehension, each absolutely convinced of her own superiority, laid claim to the apple. Hera, queen of the gods, wife of Zeus, goddess of marriage and women, she who commanded the respect of all Olympus. Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, born from Zeus's head, virgin and terrible, she who had never known defeat in battle or debate. An Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, she who could make any heart burn with desire, she who had walked from the sea foam like a dream made flesh. Each goddess looked at the apple and saw only truth. Of course it was meant for her. How could it be otherwise? Hera saw her regal bearing, her divine authority, her position as the most powerful female deity in the pantheon. Athena saw her wisdom, her strategic brilliance, her perfect virgin beauty, unmarred by the weaknesses of desire. Aphrodite saw her perfect form, her irresistible allure, her power to bring gods and mortals to their knees with a single glance. The argument that followed was not the civilized debate of philosophers or the measured discourse of diplomats. It was the howling of cosmic forces suddenly set against each other, the grinding of tectonic plates in the realm of the divine. Each goddess marshaled her arguments, her supporters, her threats. Hera promised political power, dominion over kingdoms, the favor of the most powerful goddess in heaven. Athena offered wisdom beyond mortal comprehension, victory in all battles, the gift of perfect strategy. Aphrodite whispered of love, of the most beautiful woman in the world, of passion that would make men forget their own names. But the gods, for all their power, had learned one crucial lesson over the millennia. Never, ever, under any circumstances, judge a contest between goddesses. The last god foolish enough to make such a choice had been torn apart by the losers, his essence scattered across the cosmos like ash in a hurricane. Even Zeus, king of the gods, master of lightning, he who had overthrown his own father and ruled heaven with an iron fist. Even he looked upon this situation and felt something that gods rarely experience: fear. So Zeus, in what he surely thought was a moment of divine wisdom, made a decision that would prove to be the most catastrophic choice in mythological history. He would not judge the contest himself. Instead, he would delegate the responsibility to a mortal, someone far enough removed from the divine politics of Olympus to make an impartial decision. Someone innocent, someone pure, someone who could not possibly understand the cosmic forces he was about to unleash. He chose Paris, a shepherd prince of Troy. Paris, son of King Priam of Troy, was living the life of a shepherd on the slopes of Mount Ida, far from the politics and intrigues of his royal birthright. He had been exposed as an infant due to a prophecy that he would bring destruction to Troy, but had been saved by shepherds and raised in ignorance of his true heritage. He was beautiful, as befitted a prince, skilled with the shepherd's pipe, gentle with his flocks, and blissfully unaware that he was about to become the instrument of the god's vengeance upon the mortal world. When Hermes, messenger of the gods, appeared before him with 3 goddesses in tow, Paris must have thought he was experiencing some shepherd's dream, some vision brought on by too much wine or too little sleep. But the reality was far more terrifying than any nightmare. He was being asked to judge between 3 of the most powerful beings in existence, each of whom could destroy him with a thought, each of whom was accustomed to being worshipped, not evaluated. The goddesses presented their cases with all the subtlety of a thunderstorm. Hera approached first, her bearing regal and imperious, her beauty the terrible beauty of absolute power. She spoke of kingdoms, of ruling over all of Asia, of power that would make his name echo through the ages. She painted visions of armies bowing before him, of cities opening their gates at his approach, of a throne that would make him the equal of the greatest kings who had ever lived. All he had to do was choose her, recognize her as the fairest, and the world would be his. Athena came next, her grey eyes flashing with the light of pure intellect, her form radiating the controlled violence of a warrior goddess. She offered him wisdom that would make him the greatest tactician who had ever lived, victory in every battle, the strategic mind that could outwit any enemy. She spoke of glory won through skill and intelligence, of battles won before they were fought, of a fame that would last forever because it was earned through merit rather than given through favor. Finally, Aphrodite approached, and Paris forgot how to breathe. Her beauty was not just physical, though she was certainly the most beautiful being he had ever seen. Her beauty was existential, the kind that rewrote the fundamental laws of reality around itself. When she spoke, her voice was like honey poured over velvet, like the whisper of lovers in the darkness, like the promise of every desire fulfilled. She offered him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, a love so perfect, so complete, that it would make him forget everything else that had ever mattered. Paris, young and foolish and mortal, looked at these three offers and made his choice based on what young and foolish mortals have always chosen. He chose love over power, beauty over wisdom, immediate gratification over long-term consequences. He awarded the apple to Aphrodite, and in doing so, he sealed the fate of two civilizations. Hera's rage was immediate and eternal. She who had ruled Olympus beside Zeus, she who had commanded the respect of gods and mortals alike, had been judged inferior to the goddess of desire by a mortal shepherd. Her fury would burn for generations, and it would burn hottest against Troy, the city that had produced this insolent boy who dared to slight the queen of heaven. Athena's anger was colder but no less destructive. She who had never been defeated, she who embodied the perfection of strategy and warfare, had been passed over for a goddess who represented everything she despised: passion over logic, beauty over wisdom, desire over discipline. Her grey eyes turned to steel, and she began to plan the destruction of Paris and everything he held dear with the methodical precision of a master tactician. Only Aphrodite smiled, but her smile was the smile of a predator who had just been handed the perfect weapon. She had won the contest, but more importantly, she had gained a debt from Paris that she intended to collect in full. She would give him the most beautiful woman in the world, as promised. She simply hadn't mentioned that this woman was already married to one of the most powerful kings in Greece. The judgment of Paris was complete, but the true horror was just beginning. Helen of Troy. The name itself has become synonymous with devastating beauty, with the kind of allure that starts wars and topples kingdoms. But Helen was not born to be a prize or a trophy. She was born to be a person, a woman with her own thoughts, desires, and agency. The tragedy of Helen is not just that she became the focal point of the greatest war in mythology, but that she became a symbol, a cause, a justification for violence, while her own voice was lost in the chorus of men declaring war in her name. Helen was the daughter of Zeus and Leda, born from a union that was itself an act of divine deception. Zeus had approached Leda in the form of a swan, and from this union came Helen, whose beauty was literally divine. She was raised in Sparta, where her supernatural allure attracted suitors from across the known world. Kings and princes came to court her, each hoping to win the hand of the most beautiful woman who had ever lived. Among these suitors was Menelaus, brother of Agamemnon, a man who would become king of Sparta through marriage to Helen. Also among them was Odysseus, who would later become famous for his cunning during the Trojan War. It was Odysseus who proposed a solution to the problem of Helen's marriage. All the suitors would swear an oath to defend whichever man Helen chose as her husband, ensuring that her marriage would be protected by the combined might of Greece. The oath of Tyndareus, as it came to be known, seemed like a reasonable solution at the time. It ensured that Helen's marriage would be stable, that no rejected suitor would attempt to steal her away, and that Greece would remain united rather then torn apart by competing claims for the world's most beautiful woman. What none of the suitors realized was that they were signing their own death warrants, binding themselves to a conflict that would consume a generation. Helen chose Menelaus, and for a time it seemed as though the matter was settled. She became Queen of Sparta, bore a daughter named Hermione, and lived the life of a royal wife. But the gods had other plans. Aphrodite had not forgotten her debt to Paris, and she was about to collect it in the most destructive way possible when Paris arrived in Sparta as a guest of Menelaus. He was no longer the simple shepherd who had judged the goddesses. He had been recognized as a prince of Troy, had returned to his father's palace, and now traveled as a diplomatic envoy. His mission was supposedly peaceful, a matter of trade and diplomacy between Troy and Sparta. But Aphrodite had other plans. The goddess of love struck both Paris and Helen with an overwhelming passion, a desire so intense that it obliterated all other considerations. Helen, who had been a faithful wife and devoted mother, suddenly saw only Paris. Paris, who had come to Sparta as a guest, suddenly saw only Helen. The bonds of hospitality, the sanctity of marriage, the welfare of their respective kingdoms, all of these became meaningless in the face of divine compulsion. When Paris departed Sparta, Helen went with him. Whether she went willingly, compelled by Aphrodite's power, or was taken by force, the ancient sources disagree. But the result was the same. The most beautiful woman in the world was gone, taken from her husband's house by a foreign prince, and with her went the stability of the ancient world. Rage was immediate and consuming. He had been humiliated, his honor destroyed, his wife stolen by a guest who had eaten at his table and enjoyed his protection. But Menelaus was not just a wronged husband, he was a king, and an attack on his household was an attack on his kingdom. More importantly, he was the brother of Agamemnon, the most powerful king in Greece, and an insult to one brother was an insult to both. Agamemnon saw opportunity in his brother's humiliation. He had long dreamed of uniting Greece under his leadership, of leading a great expedition that would establish his name for all time. The theft of Helen provided the perfect justification for war, a cause that would rally all the Greek kings to his banner. But more than that, it provided a way to enforce the oath of Tyndareus, binding all of Helen's former suitors to his cause. The call went out across Greece. Helen had been stolen. Honor demanded satisfaction, and the oath required vengeance. One by one, the heroes of Greece began to gather. Achilles, the greatest warrior who had ever lived, came from his kingdom in Euboea, bringing with him his Myrmidons, soldiers whose loyalty was absolute and whose skill in battle was legendary. Ajax, strong as a mountain and skilled with every weapon, came from Salamis. Diomedes, beloved of Athena, came from Argos. Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, came reluctantly, bound by his own oath. But the gathering of the Greek forces was not without its complications. The gods, already divided by the judgment of Paris, began to choose sides. Hera and Athena, still burning with rage over their rejection, threw their support behind the Greeks. Aphrodite, bound by her promise to Paris, protected the Trojans. Apollo, god of music and prophecy, favored Troy. Poseidon, god of the sea, shifted his allegiance based on his own mysterious motivations. What should have been a simple matter of justice, a wronged husband seeking the return of his wife, became a proxy war between the gods themselves. The mortals gathering for battle thought they were fighting for honor, for glory, for the return of stolen property. They had no idea that they were merely the instruments of divine vengeance, weapons in a war that had begun with a golden apple and would end with the destruction of one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. The ships were loaded, the warriors armed, and the greatest expedition in human history prepared to sail. But even departure was not simple, for the gods had more tricks to play, more suffering to inflict, more lessons to teach about the price of defying divine will. The Greek fleet assembled at Aulis, 1,000 ships bearing the finest warriors of the age, ready to sail across the Aegean Sea to bring Troy to its knees. But as the ships sat in the harbor, the wind died. Day after day, the sea remained calm as glass, the sails hanging limp, the warriors growing restless and impatient. What should have been a quick voyage across familiar waters became an endless waiting game, and the morale of the expedition began to crumble. Agamemnon, supreme commander of the Greek forces, consulted his seers and priests, desperate to understand why the gods had abandoned their cause. The answer, when it came, was more horrifying than any military defeat could have been. Artemis, virgin goddess of the hunt, had been offended by something Agamemnon had said or done, and she would not allow the winds to blow until she received satisfaction. The exact nature of Agamemnon's offense varies depending on who tells the story. Some say he had boasted that he was a better hunter than the goddess herself, a claim that would have been laughably arrogant if it had not been so dangerous. Others claim he had killed a sacred deer in one of Artemis's groves, or that he had made some other slight against her divine prerogatives. But the specific offense mattered less than the goddess's response. She would not be appeased by ordinary sacrifice or simple apology. Artemis demanded the life of Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia. The demand was monstrous, a violation of every principle of justice and natural law. Iphigenia was innocent of any wrongdoing, a young woman whose only crime was being born to a father who had offended a goddess. She was beloved by her parents, betrothed to Achilles, destined for a life of happiness and fulfillment. But the gods cared nothing for mortal notions of justice or fairness. They demanded what they demanded, and mortals either complied or faced the consequences. Agamemnon was faced with an impossible choice. He could refuse to sacrifice his daughter and watch his expedition collapse, his authority crumble, his brothers' honor remain unavenged. Or he could commit the most heinous act a father could commit, murder his own child to appease the bloodthirsty whims of a goddess. The choice was between his role as a father and his role as a king, between his personal morality and his public duty. He chose duty over love, public honor over private conscience. He sent word to his wife, Clytemnestra, that Iphigenia was to be married to Achilles at Aulis, a joyous occasion that would unite two of the most powerful families in Greece. Clytemnestra, delighted by the prospect of such a prestigious match for her daughter, brought Iphigenia to the Greek camp dressed as a bride, her heart full of joy and hope. The deception was perfect and perfectly cruel. Iphigenia arrived expecting to be married to the greatest warrior of her generation, only to discover that she was to be sacrificed to the bloodthirsty demands of a goddess. The betrayal was complete, by her father, who had lied to bring her to her death, by the gods, who demanded innocent blood to satisfy their wounded pride, by the entire system of divine justice that treated mortal lives as expendable. But even here, even in this moment of ultimate horror, the gods were not finished with their cruelty. Some versions of the story claim that Artemis, at the last moment, substituted a deer for Iphigenia on the altar and spirited the girl away to serve as her priestess. This might seem like mercy, but it was actually a deeper form of torture. Clytemnestra was allowed to believe that her daughter was dead, that her husband had murdered their child for the sake of his ambition. The grief and rage that consumed her would poison her marriage, her family, and ultimately lead to Agamemnon's own death. Whether Iphigenia died or was saved, the effect was the same. A family was destroyed. A mother's love was turned to hatred, and a daughter's life was sacrificed to the petty vanity of the gods. The wind began to blow, the ships sailed for Troy, and the first blood of the Trojan War was that of an innocent girl whose only crime was being born to a man who had offended divine pride. The fleet that sailed from Aulis was not just carrying warriors and weapons. It was carrying the curse of filicide, the weight of betrayed trust, and the certainty that the gods would exact their price in blood for every favor granted and every slight forgiven. The Trojan War had claimed its first victim before the first. Battle had even been fought. The Greek ships beached on the shores of Troy like a plague of locusts, disgorging warriors whose names would echo through eternity. The city that rose before them was not some barbarian stronghold or minor trading post, but one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. Its walls built by the gods themselves, its towers reaching toward heaven like fingers of defiance. Troy, called Ilium by its inhabitants, was a city of marble and bronze, of wide streets and magnificent palaces, of temples that gleamed in the Mediterranean sun. Its walls were so high and thick that they seemed to merge with the sky itself, and its gates were massive portals that had never been breached by enemy force. The city commanded the entrance to the Hellespont, the narrow strait that connected the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, and its wealth came from the tribute paid by every merchant ship that passed through its waters. King Priam ruled from his palace like a benevolent god, his sons and daughters filling the royal household with laughter and music. Hector, the greatest of his sons, was everything a prince should be. Brave in battle, wise in council, beloved by his people, devoted to his wife and child. Paris, the cause of all this trouble, was the black sheep of the family, but even he was Priam's son, and the old king would not hand him over to the Greeks no matter what the cost. The siege of Troy was unlike any conflict that had come before. This was not a quick raid or a seasonal war, but a commitment that would consume a generation. The Greeks had come not just to recover Helen, but to destroy the power of Troy forever, to ensure that no city would ever again dare to defy the united might of Greece. They built a fortified camp on the beach, complete with walls and towers, a city of war that would be their home for the next 10 years. But the gods were not content to let mortals fight their own battles. From the very beginning, Olympus was divided, with each deity choosing sides based on their own grievances and desires. Hera and Athena, still burning with rage over the judgment of Paris, threw their full support behind the Greeks. Aphrodite, bound by her promise to Paris, protected the Trojans. Apollo, god of music and prophecy, favored Troy for reasons that were never entirely clear. Poseidon, god of the sea, shifted his allegiance based on his own mysterious motivations and ancient grudges. The result was a war that was fought on 2 levels: the mortal combat between Greek and Trojan warriors, and the divine struggle between the gods themselves. Every battle was influenced by divine intervention, every victory or defeat shaped by the whims of immortal beings who treated human lives like pieces on a game board. Warriors would find themselves suddenly filled with supernatural strength or paralyzed by divine terror. Arrows would be deflected by invisible hands or guided to their targets by godly will. The very weather became a weapon. with storms and calm seas deployed as tools of war. The early years of the siege were marked by a series of raids and skirmishes, rather than full-scale battles. The Greeks could not breach the walls of Troy, but they could devastate the surrounding countryside, capturing the smaller cities and settlements that provided Troy with supplies and support. Each victory brought them closer to their goal of isolating the great city. But each victory also brought them deeper into the web of divine manipulation that surrounded the war. It was during one of these raids that Achilles, the greatest warrior among the Greeks, captured Chryses, daughter of a priest of Apollo. The priest Chryses came to the Greek camp with a fortune in gold and silver, begging for the return of his daughter. His pleas were reasonable, his offer generous, and his cause just. But Agamemnon, drunk on power and success, refused to release the girl. She was his prize, his reward for the hardships of war, and he would not give her up for any price. The priest's prayers to Apollo were answered with divine fury, the god of music and prophecy, who could be gentle as a summer breeze or terrible as a plague, chose to remind the Greeks that some insults carried a price beyond mortal comprehension. He descended from Olympus with his silver bow, his arrows carrying death and disease, and for 9 days he stalked through the Greek camp like a hunter culling a diseased herd. The plague that followed was unlike anything the Greeks had experienced. Warriors who had survived countless battles died writhing in agony, their bodies consumed by fever and covered in boils. The sick outnumbered the healthy, the dead outnumbered the living, and the very air became thick with the stench of corruption and death. The great expedition, which had seemed so glorious and righteous, became a charnel house where heroes died like animals. Finally, Achilles, whose mother was herself a goddess, and who could recognize divine intervention when he saw it, called for an assembly of the Greek leaders. The seer Calchas, under Achilles' protection, revealed the truth. Apollo was punishing the Greeks for Agamemnon's insult to his priest. The only way to end the plague was to return Chryses to her father without ransom and to make proper sacrifice. To the offended god, Agamemnon, faced with the collapse of his army and the failure of his grand expedition, was forced to agree. But his pride, that fatal flaw that had already cost him his daughter and his wife's love, would not allow him to accept this humiliation quietly. If he had to give up his prize, he would take another, and the prize he chose belonged to the one man in the Greek army who was more dangerous than any Trojan warrior. Achilles himself, Briseis her name, is often forgotten in the grand narrative of the Trojan War, reduced to a mere prize, a cause of conflict between two proud men. But Briseis was a person, a queen in her own right, before the Greeks sacked her city and killed her husband. She became Achilles' concubine, not by choice, but by the brutal logic of war, and her fate became entangled with the destiny of the greatest warrior who ever lived. When Agamemnon was forced to return Chryses to her father, his wounded pride demanded compensation. He could not bear to be the only Greek leader to lose his prize, the only one to be humiliated by divine intervention. So he turned his eyes to Briseis, the woman who had been awarded to Achilles as his share of the spoils. The logic was simple and brutal. If the King of Kings had to give up his concubine, then the greatest warrior would have to give up his. Achilles' response was immediate and incandescent. This was not just about Briseis, though he had grown to care for her in his own way. This was about honor, about respect, about the fundamental principles that held the Greek army together. Achilles had followed Agamemnon to Troy not out of loyalty or duty, but for the promise of glory and the proper recognition of his worth. Now that same leader was treating him like a common soldier, someone whose possessions could be redistributed at will. The confrontation between Achilles and Agamemnon was a collision between two different types of power, the authority of kingship and the supremacy of individual excellence. Agamemnon represented the old order, where birth and position determined worth, where kings ruled because they were kings and their word was law. Achilles represented something newer and more dangerous, the idea that merit should be rewarded, that excellence should be recognized, that the greatest warrior should receive the greatest honors. The argument that followed was not a civilized debate, but a primal scream, the sound of an alliance tearing itself apart. Achilles accused Agamemnon of cowardice, of hiding behind his troops while braver men died for his cause. Agamemnon accused Achilles of insubordination, of placing his own pride above the welfare of the army. Both men were right, and both men were wrong, and the gods watched with interest as the Greek alliance began to devour itself. It was Athena who intervened, appearing to Achilles at the moment when his hand was on his sword, when he was about to kill Agamemnon and shatter the Greek cause forever. The goddess of wisdom and warfare whispered in his ear, reminding him that greater glory awaited if he controlled his temper, that killing Agamemnon would make him a pariah rather than a hero. She promised him that the king would pay for this insult, that gifts and honors would come to make up for this humiliation. But Achilles was not interested in future compensation or eventual vindication. His rage was immediate and absolute, a force of nature that would not be appeased by promises or threats. If Agamemnon wanted to treat him like a common soldier, then Agamemnon could fight his war without him. If the King of Kings wanted to claim all the prizes for himself, then let him win all the battles by himself as well. The withdrawal of Achilles from the war was not just the loss of a single warrior, however great. It was the loss of the Myrmidons, the most disciplined and effective troops in the Greek army. It was the loss of the one fighter who could face any Trojan champion and emerge victorious. Most importantly, it was the loss of the psychological advantage that Achilles' presence provided, the knowledge that the Greeks possessed a warrior who was literally unstoppable in battle. But Achilles' rage went deeper than military considerations. He called upon his mother, Thetis, the sea goddess, who had loved a mortal man and borne a son who was destined to be greater than his father. Thetis had always known that her son faced a terrible choice, a long, peaceful life of obscurity, or a short, glorious life that would end in death at Troy. She had tried to prevent him from going to war, had even disguised him as a girl to hide him from the Greek recruiters. But Achilles had chosen glory over longevity, fame over safety, and now he was asking his mother to help him achieve the ultimate revenge. Thetis brought her son's complaint to Zeus himself, the king of the gods, the final arbiter of divine justice. She reminded him of the service she had once done him, the time she had helped him when the other gods had plotted rebellion. She asked him to honor her son by giving victory to the Trojans, to let Agamemnon and the Greeks suffer defeat until they realized how much they needed Achilles, until they came crawling back with proper apologies and appropriate gifts. Zeus agreed, though he knew the cost would be terrible. To give victory to the Trojans meant allowing his own favored Greeks to suffer and die. It meant watching heroes fall, cities burn, and families destroyed. But the king of the gods was bound by his promise to Thetis, and more than that, he was curious to see how this divine experiment would play out. The gods had started this war with their vanity and their meddling. Now they would see it through to its bitter conclusion. The prayer of Thetis was answered, and the tide of war turned against the Greeks. Without Achilles to lead them, without his Myrmidons to spearhead their attacks, the Greek army began to suffer defeat after defeat. Hector, the greatest of the Trojan warriors, led sortie after sortie against the Greek camp, pushing the invaders back toward their ships, threatening to burn their fleet and trap them on the shores of Troy. But the gods were not finished with their manipulations. Each side had divine supporters, and each deity was determined to see their favorites triumph. The war became a chess game played by immortal beings, with mortal lives as the pieces and the future of civilization as the prize. Every battle was decided not just by skill and courage, but by which gods chose to intervene and how far they were willing to go to ensure victory for their chosen champions. The stage was set for the most destructive phase of the war, the period when the gods would abandon all pretense of neutrality and throw themselves directly into the conflict. The time of restraint was over. The time of divine warfare was about to begin. The gods of Olympus, for all their power and majesty, were petty, jealous, and vindictive creatures who treated the mortal world as their personal playground. The Trojan War gave them the perfect opportunity to settle old grudges, to test their power against each other, and to prove their superiority through the suffering of human beings. What had begun as a conflict between two cities became a proxy war between the immortal powers, with devastating consequences for everyone involved. Zeus, king of the gods, found himself in an impossible position. He was bound by his promise to Thetis to give victory to the Trojans, but he was also the father of Athena, who supported the Greeks with fanatical devotion. His wife, Hera, was equally committed to the Greek cause, driven by her hatred of Paris and her desire to see Troy destroyed. The ruler of Olympus was trapped between his divine obligations and his family relationships, and his attempts to remain neutral only made the situation worse. The gods began to take sides openly, abandoning all pretense of divine impartiality. Hera and Athena threw their full support behind the Greeks, using their divine powers to strengthen their champions and weaken their enemies. Aphrodite protected the Trojans, particularly Paris, whose safety was essential to her own reputation. Apollo, god of music and prophecy, favored Troy for reasons that were never entirely clear. Poseidon, god of the sea, shifted his allegiance based on his own mysterious motivations and ancient grudges. The result was chaos on a cosmic scale. Battles that should have been decided by skill and courage were instead determined by divine intervention. Warriors would find themselves suddenly filled with supernatural strength, able to lift boulders and hurl spears with impossible force. Others would be struck by divine terror, their courage evaporating like morning mist, their weapons becoming too heavy to lift. The very elements became weapons in the gods' war. Storms would rise from clear skies to scatter enemy formations. Earthquakes would open chasms to swallow opposing armies, and fires would spring from nowhere to consume supply trains. The mortal warriors, caught between these divine forces, began to suffer catastrophic losses. Heroes who had seemed invincible were struck down by arrows guided by godly hands. Entire battalions were destroyed by supernatural disasters. The careful strategies of human commanders were rendered meaningless by the whims of immortal beings, who cared nothing for military, tactics, or conventional warfare. It was during this period that the war reached its most savage intensity. Hector, Prince of Troy and the greatest warrior on the Trojan side, led charge after charge against the Greek fortifications, pushing the invaders back toward their ships. His bronze spear dripped with Greek blood, His war cry struck terror into enemy hearts, and his very presence on the battlefield inspired his men to acts of desperate heroism. But even Hector, for all his skill and courage, was merely a pawn in the gods' game. His victories and defeats determined by which deities chose to aid or abandon him. The Greeks, demoralized by their losses and desperate to break the stalemate, began to consider desperate measures. Some suggested abandoning the siege and returning to Greece, accepting that Helen was lost forever. Others proposed a direct assault on the walls of Troy, regardless of the cost in human lives. But it was Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, who proposed the most audacious plan of all, an infiltration of Troy itself, a mission to steal the Palladium, the sacred statue of Athena that protected the city. The Palladium was not just any religious artifact, but the divine guarantee of Troy's invincibility. As long as it remained within the city walls, Troy could never be conquered, no matter how many armies besieged it or how many heroes assaulted its gates. The statue had been given to the city by Athena herself in the early days of Troy's founding, a token of divine protection that had never failed. To steal it would be an act of supreme sacrilege, a violation of every law of gods and men, but it might also be the key to victory. The mission was entrusted to Odysseus and Diomedes, two of the cleverest and most ruthless of the Greek heroes. Under cover of darkness, they scaled the walls of Troy, navigated the maze-like streets, and penetrated the sacred precinct where the Palladium was housed. The theft itself was almost anticlimactic, a simple matter of overpowering the guards and carrying away the statue, but the consequences were immediate and devastating. Athena, who had been supporting the Greeks throughout the war, was outraged by the theft of her sacred image. The violation of her temple by the very men she had been protecting struck her as the ultimate betrayal, an act of impiety so profound that it demanded immediate punishment. Her grey eyes blazed with fury, and she began to plot a revenge that would make the Trojan War seem like a minor skirmish. But the theft of the Palladium had achieved its intended purpose. Troy's divine protection was broken, its walls were no longer impregnable, and for the first time in 10 years, the city was vulnerable to assault. The Greeks, sensing their opportunity, began to prepare for a final, desperate attack. But the gods had one more twist in store, one final manipulation that would determine the outcome of the war in the most unexpected way possible. While the gods played their deadly games and heroes fought their endless battles, Achilles remained in his tent, nursing his wounded pride and watching his former comrades die. His rage against Agamemnon had not cooled with time. If anything, it had grown hotter and more consuming. Every Greek defeat validated his importance. Every casualty proved how much the army needed him, and every plea for him to return to battle only strengthened his resolve to remain withdrawn. But Achilles was not entirely alone in his self-imposed exile. With him was Patroclus, his closest friend, his constant companion, the one person in the world who truly understood the heart that beat beneath the armor of the greatest warrior who had ever lived. Patroclus was older than Achilles, gentler in temperament, more concerned with the welfare of others than with personal glory. Where Achilles was fire, Patroclus was water. Where Achilles was the storm, Patroclus was the calm that followed. The relationship between Achilles and Patroclus was one of the most profound bonds in all of mythology. A friendship so deep and complete that it transcended the ordinary categories of human relationship. Some called them lovers, others insisted they were merely friends. But such distinctions missed the essential truth. They were two halves of a single soul, each incomplete without the other, bound together by ties stronger than blood or marriage, or divine commandment. As the Greek army suffered defeat after defeat, as Hector drove the Trojans ever closer to the Greek ships, Patroclus found himself torn between loyalty to his friend and concern for their dying comrades. He watched Greek heroes fall, saw the wounded carried from the battlefield, heard the cries of the dying, and his gentle heart could not bear the suffering. Every night he pleaded with Achilles to return to battle, to set aside his anger and save their friends. Every night Achilles refused, his pride harder than bronze, his rage more enduring than stone. The crisis came when Hector led a massive Trojan assault against the Greek fortifications, threatening to burn the ships and trap the entire army on the shores of Troy. The battle was desperate, with Greek heroes falling like wheat before the scythe, their blood staining the sand red, their screams echoing across the plain. Even Agamemnon, the proud king who had started this conflict with his arrogance, was wounded and forced to retreat, his royal blood mixing with that of common soldiers. It was then that Patroclus came to Achilles with a desperate plea, not for his friend to return to battle, but for permission to go in his place. If Achilles would not fight, then let Patroclus wear his armor, carry his shield, lead the Myrmidons into battle. The sight of Achilles' armor would strike terror into Trojan hearts, rally the Greek spirits, and perhaps turn the tide of battle. It was a reasonable request, a practical solution to an impossible situation, but it was also a death sentence, and somewhere in his heart Achilles must have known it. Achilles agreed to his friend's request, but with conditions that revealed both his love and his selfishness. Patroclus could wear the armor, could lead the Myrmidons, could drive the Trojans back from the ships. But he was not to pursue them too far, not to attempt an assault on the city itself, not to seek the kind of individual glory that might eclipse Achilles' own reputation. It was to be a limited engagement, a tactical intervention, nothing more. Patroclus agreed to these conditions, though his gentle nature rebelled against such calculated limitations. He donned the armor that had been forged by the gods themselves, took up the spear that had never missed its target, and led the Myrmidons into battle like a hero out of legend. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Trojans, seeing what they thought was Achilles returning to war, began to retreat in panic. The Greek spirits soared, their wounded heroes found new strength, and for a moment it seemed as though the tide of war might truly turn. But the gods were watching, and they had their own plans for this battle. Apollo, the far-shooting god who had favored Troy throughout the war, could not allow this Greek resurgence to continue unchecked. He saw through the deception immediately, recognizing that this was not Achilles but his gentler friend, and he began to weave a trap that would destroy not just Patroclus, but the very soul of the greatest warrior who had ever lived. Patroclus, drunk on victory and the intoxication of battle, forgot his friend's warnings and pursued the fleeing Trojans toward the walls of Troy itself. 3 times he assaulted the gates, his borrowed glory making him seem invincible. 3 times the gods themselves pushed him back, warning him that this was not his fate, that he was overreaching his mortal limitations. But Patroclus was beyond listening, beyond caution, driven by the same heroic madness that afflicted all the great warriors of his age. It was then that Apollo struck, not directly, but through the agency of mortal weapons, guided by divine will. First came Euphorbus, a young Trojan warrior whose spear, guided by the god's invisible hand, found the one gap in Achilles' divine armor. The wound was not fatal, but it staggered Patroclus, stripped away the divine protection that had made him seem invincible, and left him vulnerable to mortal attack. Then came Hector, Prince of Troy, who had been retreating in what he thought was defeat, but now saw his opportunity for the greatest victory of his career. He drove his spear through Patroclus's chest, piercing the heart that had been so full of compassion and loyalty. As Patroclus fell, dying in armor that was not his own, fighting a battle that should not have been his to fight, his last words were not of regret or fear, but of warning. Hector's own death was coming, and it would come at the hands of Achilles himself. The death of Patroclus was not just the loss of a single warrior, however beloved. It was the breaking of the gentlest heart in the Greek army, the extinguishing of the one voice that had counseled mercy and compassion. More than that, it was the awakening of something terrible in Achilles, a rage so pure and destructive that it would make his previous anger seem like a gentle breeze. The gods had wanted to see what would happen when the greatest warrior who had ever lived was pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. They were about to find out. The news of Patroclus' death reached Achilles like a lightning bolt striking the earth, shattering his world into fragments that could never be reassembled. The grief that consumed him was not the ordinary sorrow of loss, but something primal and overwhelming, a cosmic force that threatened to tear apart the very fabric of reality. He tore his hair, rent his clothes, covered himself with dust and ashes, and his cries of anguish echoed across the Greek camp like the howling of a wounded god. But grief, terrible as it was, quickly transformed into something far more dangerous: rage. Not the petty anger he had felt toward Agamemnon, not the wounded pride that had kept him from battle, but a fury so pure and absolute that it seemed to burn away everything human in him. This was the wrath that the poets would sing of for generations, the anger that would make his name synonymous with vengeance and destruction. Thetis, his divine mother, felt her son's anguish from the depths of the sea and rose to comfort him. But when she looked upon Achilles, she saw not her beloved child, but something that frightened even her immortal heart. The gentle boy she had raised, the hero she had tried to protect, was gone, replaced by a force of nature dedicated to a single purpose: the complete and utter destruction of everyone responsible for Patroclus' death. Achilles' first instinct was to rush immediately into battle, to tear apart the Trojan army with his bare hands, if necessary. But he had no armor. The divine panoply that had protected him throughout his career had been stripped from Patroclus' corpse by Hector as a trophy of victory. Thetis promised to bring him new armor, crafted by Hephaestus himself, the divine smith whose creations surpassed anything made by mortal hands. But the armor would take time to forge, and in the meantime, Achilles could only wait and let his rage build to even more terrible proportions. The armor that Hephaestus created was more than mere protection. It was a work of art that depicted the entire cosmos, from the earth and sea to the stars in their courses. The shield alone was a masterpiece, showing scenes of peace and war, of cities under siege and festivals in celebration of the full spectrum of human experience. It was beautiful and terrible, a fitting protection for the warrior who was about to become the most feared force on the battlefield of Troy. When Achilles finally emerged from his tent, clad in his new armor and burning with divine fury, the very earth seemed to tremble beneath his feet. His war cry was not the shout of a mortal warrior, but the roar of an earthquake, the sound of mountains falling into the sea. The Trojans, who had been celebrating their victory over Patroclus, suddenly realized that they had not defeated Achilles, but merely awakened him, and that their triumph had transformed their greatest enemy into something beyond human comprehension. But before Achilles could unleash his vengeance on the Trojans, he had to deal with the matter of Agamemnon and the quarrel that had started this entire catastrophe. The King of Kings, seeing what his pride and stubbornness had ultimately cost, came forward with elaborate apologies and magnificent gifts. He offered to return Briseis unharmed, to give Achilles vast treasures, to acknowledge his supremacy among the Greek warriors. It was everything that Achilles had demanded months before, when such gestures might have mattered. But Achilles was no longer interested in apologies or gifts or recognition. His rage had burned away all such petty concerns, leaving only the pure desire for vengeance. He accepted Agamemnon's offerings with indifference, not because he forgave the insult, but because such matters no longer had any meaning for him. There was only one thing he wanted now: to kill Hector and as many Trojans as possible before his own prophesied death claimed him. The reconciliation between Achilles and Agamemnon was a hollow mockery of justice, a meaningless gesture that came far too late to repair the damage that had been done. But it served its purpose. The Greek army was united once more, and its greatest weapon was ready to be unleashed upon Troy. The gods themselves held their breath, waiting to see what destruction would follow in the wake of Achilles' return to war. The answer came swiftly and brutally. When Achilles finally took the field, he was no longer fighting a war, but conducting a massacre. His spear never missed its target, his sword cut through armor like parchment, and his very presence on the battlefield was enough to send entire companies of Trojans fleeing in terror. He killed without mercy, without hesitation, without any trace of the heroic code that had once governed his conduct. This was not war, but extermination, not battle, but butchery. The river Scamander, which ran red with Trojan blood, became so clogged with corpses that it could no longer flow. The river god himself rose from the waters to protest this pollution, this violation of the natural order. But Achilles fought even the river, his rage so complete that he was willing to battle the forces of nature itself if they stood between him and his vengeance. The gods, seeing the destruction that Achilles was wreaking, began to intervene more directly. This was no longer a war between mortals, but a cosmic catastrophe that threatened to upset the fundamental balance of the universe. Divine fought against divine. Immortal powers clashed above the battlefield, and the very heavens shook with the sound of godly combat. Ares, god of war, fought against Athena. Aphrodite battled Diomedes. Apollo faced off against Poseidon. The war had become exactly what the gods had wanted from the beginning, a contest that would prove their own supremacy over the mortal world. But at the center of all this divine chaos was Achilles, no longer quite mortal, but not yet divine, a force of pure destruction that even the gods found difficult to control. He had become what they had made him, the perfect instrument of vengeance, the ultimate expression of divine wrath channeled through human form, and his target was clear and unchanging: Hector, Prince of Troy. The man who had killed his beloved Patroclus, and who must pay the ultimate price for that crime. Hector knew he was going to die. The knowledge came to him not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual certainty, like the approach of winter or the setting of the sun. He had seen Achilles return to battle, had witnessed the carnage that followed in his wake, had watched the greatest warriors of Troy fall like wheat before the scythe. There was no shame in this knowledge, no cowardice in recognizing the inevitable. Hector was the bravest man in Troy, but he was not a fool, and only a fool would believe he could survive a confrontation with the force of nature that Achilles had become. Yet for all his certainty about his fate, Hector felt no despair. He was a prince of Troy, a defender of his city and his people, and he would meet his death as he had lived his life, with honor, with dignity, and with absolute commitment to his duty. If his death was the price that must be paid to give Troy even a few more days of life, then it was a price he would pay gladly. The final confrontation came, as such things always do, when all other options had been exhausted and retreat was no longer possible. The two greatest warriors of their generation faced each other on the plain before the city, while gods and mortals alike watched from their respective vantage points, knowing that they were about to witness a duel that would be remembered until the end of time. But even here, at this climactic moment, the gods could not resist one final intervention. Apollo, who had protected and guided Hector throughout the war, suddenly abandoned him, withdrawing his divine favor at the moment when it was most desperately needed. Athena, still burning with rage over Achilles' earlier slight, appeared to Hector in the guise of his brother Deiphobus, promising aid and support in the coming battle. The deception was cruel even by divine standards. Hector, believing he had an ally at his side, fought with the courage and skill that had made him famous throughout the ancient world. His spear work was flawless, his defensive maneuvers perfect, his strategic thinking as sharp as his bronze blade. For a moment, it seemed as though he might actually have a chance, that skill and experience might triumph over raw fury and supernatural enhancement. But when Hector cast his spear and missed Achilles by inches, when he turned to ask Deiphobus for another weapon, he found only empty air. The brother he thought was fighting beside him was nothing but a divine illusion, a trick of the goddess who had already decided his fate. In that moment of realization, when Hector understood that he had been abandoned by gods and men alike, he showed the true measure of his heroism. He did not beg for mercy, did not attempt to flee, did not curse the immortals who had betrayed him. Instead, he drew his sword and prepared to sell his life as dearly as possible. The final moments of the duel were swift and brutal. Achilles, with his divine armor and supernatural fury, was simply too much for any mortal warrior to overcome. His spear found the one gap in Hector's armor, the small space at the throat where the bronze plates met, and drove through flesh and bone with the force of divine vengeance. Hector fell, his blood staining the dusty ground, his life ebbing away even as he tried to speak his final words. But even in death, Hector was not granted the dignity that his heroism deserved. Achilles, consumed by a rage that had burned away all traces of honor and humanity, committed an act that shocked even the gods in their callousness. He tied Hector's the body to his chariot and dragged it around the walls of Troy, while the prince's parents and wife watched in horror from the battlements. Above, King Priam's anguish was the cry of every parent who has lost a child, magnified and intensified by the public nature of his son's desecration. Queen Hecuba's grief was the wail of all mothers throughout history who have watched their children destroyed by war. But perhaps the most heartbreaking sight of all was Andromache, Hector's young wife, who had begged him not to fight, who had foreseen this very outcome, and who now watched her husband's body being defiled, while their infant son played innocently at her feet. The desecration of Hector's corpse was not just an act of personal vengeance, but a violation of every law that governed civilized warfare. The dead were supposed to be honored, their bodies treated with respect, their families allowed to mourn and bury them properly. By dragging Hector's corpse around the city walls, Achilles was not just dishonoring his enemy, but threatening the fundamental order that kept society from descending into barbarism. The gods themselves were appalled by this. violation of divine law. Even those who had supported Achilles throughout the war began to question whether their champion had gone too far, whether his rage had transformed him from a hero into a monster. Apollo, who had favored Troy, raged against this desecration of his former protege, but it was Zeus himself who finally intervened, sending a divine message that would force Achilles to confront the consequences of his actions and perhaps recover some trace of his lost humanity. For 12 days, Achilles dragged Hector's body around Patroclus's tomb, as if the repeated violation of his enemy's corpse could somehow bring back his beloved friend or ease the agony in his heart. But the dead remained dead, the grief remained undiminished, and the rage that had sustained him through his vengeance began to transform into something even more destructive: emptiness. He had achieved everything he had sought, had killed his greatest enemy, had proven his supremacy on the battlefield, and yet none of it mattered. Patroclus was still gone, and no amount of violence could change that fundamental fact. The gods, meanwhile, were engaged in heated debate about what to do with their out-of-control champion. Some argued that Achilles' actions were justified, that the loss of his beloved friend warranted any response. Others contended that he had gone too far, that his violation of divine law threatened the very foundations of cosmic order. The arguments raged for days, with immortal voices raised in anger, until finally Zeus himself issued a decree that none dared question. Achilles would be forced to give up Hector's body, but not through divine compulsion or supernatural intervention. Instead, the gods would arrange for a confrontation that would test whether any trace of humanity remained in the heart of their greatest warrior. Hermes, messenger of the gods, was dispatched to guide an unlikely embassy to the Greek camp. King Priam himself, the aged father who had lost his son, coming alone to beg for the return of his child's body. The idea was audacious to the point of madness. Priam was the king of Troy, the enemy of all Greeks, the man whose city Achilles had sworn to destroy. To enter the Greek camp alone, unarmed and defenseless, was essentially suicide. But Priam was beyond caring about his own safety, beyond considerations of political wisdom or personal survival. He was simply a father who wanted to bury his son, and he would risk anything to achieve that simple, fundamental goal. The night journey from Troy to the Greek camp was a passage through hell itself. The plain between the two armies was littered with the bodies of the dead, the air thick with the stench of corruption and decay. Supernatural terrors stalked the darkness, and the very ground seemed cursed by the blood that had been spilled upon it. But Hermes guided Priam through the dangers, protecting him from both natural hazards and supernatural threats, until finally they reached the tent of Achilles himself. What followed was one of the most extraordinary scenes in all of literature, a confrontation between two men who represented the ultimate extremes of human experience: absolute power and absolute vulnerability, consuming rage and overwhelming grief, the destroyer and the destroyed. Priam entered Achilles' tent not as a king but as a supplicant, casting aside all royal dignity to kneel before his son's killer and beg for mercy. The old king's words were not the polished rhetoric of diplomacy, but the raw, unvarnished language of parental love. He spoke of Hector not as a prince or a warrior, but as his child, the boy he had raised, the man he had watched grow into everything a father could hope for. He reminded Achilles of his own father, Peleus, who was even now waiting for news of his son, praying that he would return safely from the war. He asked Achilles to imagine how he would feel if their positions were reversed, if it were his own father kneeling before an enemy, begging for the return of his son's body. For the first time since Patroclus's death, Achilles felt something other than rage or emptiness. The sight of this proud king reduced to begging, this powerful ruler made powerless by love and grief, penetrated the armor of fury that had protected him from all other emotions. He saw in Priam's tears the reflection of his own anguish, recognized. In the old man's desperation, the same love that had driven his own quest for vengeance. But the moment of recognition was also a moment of terrible self-awareness. Achilles realized what he had become, what his rage had transformed him into, and the knowledge was almost too much to bear. He had violated every principle of honor and decency, had become the very thing he had always sworn to fight against. A destroyer rather than a protector, a source of chaos rather than order. The reconciliation between Achilles and Priam was not a matter of forgiveness or absolution, but of mutual recognition of their shared humanity. Both men had been shaped by love and destroyed by loss. Both had been caught up in forces beyond their control. Both had paid prices that no human being should have to pay. In that moment of understanding, something of Achilles' lost humanity was restored, and something of Priam's royal dignity was recovered. Achilles agreed to return Hector's body, but more than that, he agreed to grant a truce that would allow Troy to hold proper funeral rites for their greatest hero. For 12 days, the same period during which he had desecrated the corpse, there would be no fighting, no killing, no war. It was a small mercy in the context of such overwhelming destruction, but it was mercy nonetheless, a recognition that some things were more important than victory or vengeance. The scene that followed, as Priam prepared to leave with his son's body, was both heartbreaking and beautiful. The two enemies shared a meal, speaking not as Greek and Trojan, but as men who had suffered beyond the limits of human endurance. They looked at each other across the table and saw not the face of the enemy, but the face of loss, the expression of grief that was universal and timeless. But even as they shared this moment of humanity, both men knew that it was temporary, that the war would resume when the truce ended, that they would once again be enemies, committed to each other's destruction. The gods had allowed this brief respite, this momentary recognition of shared suffering, but they had not abandoned their cosmic game. The pieces were still on the board, the players were still committed to victory, and the final moves were yet to be played. The funeral of Hector was a spectacle of grief that transcended the boundaries between Greek and Trojan, enemy and ally, victor and vanquished. For 12 days, the people of Troy mourned their greatest hero with ceremonies that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The funeral pyre burned like a second sun, visible from miles away, a beacon of sorrow. That announced to the world that something irreplaceable had been lost forever. But even as Troy mourned, everyone knew that this was merely an interlude, a brief pause in a war that had already consumed too many lives and would consume many more before it reached its conclusion. When the funeral rites were complete, when Hector's bones had been gathered and placed in a golden urn, when the last prayers had been offered to the gods who had allowed this tragedy to unfold, the war resumed with even greater intensity than before. Achilles returned to battle with the same fury that had driven him to kill Hector, but now his rage was tempered by a strange fatalism, a knowledge that his own death was approaching as inevitably as winter follows autumn. His mother had told him long ago that he faced a choice, a long, peaceful life of obscurity or a short, glorious life that would end at Troy. He had chosen glory, and now the price of that choice was coming due. The prophecies surrounding Achilles' death were as numerous as they were ominous. Some said he would be killed by Paris, the coward whose theft of Helen had started the entire war. struck down by an arrow guided by Apollo's divine hand. Others claimed he would fall to a Trojan champion, dying in single combat as all great warriors should. Still others whispered that he would be destroyed by his own rage, that the fury which had made him invincible would ultimately consume him from within. But regardless of the specific details, everyone knew that Achilles' time was running short. There was something different about him now, something that marked him as a man approaching his fate. He fought with the same skill and ferocity as before, but there was a recklessness to his actions, a willingness to take risks that suggested he no longer cared whether he lived or died. The gods, meanwhile, were growing tired of their long game. The war had served its purpose as entertainment, as a way to settle their petty disputes and demonstrate their power over mortal affairs. But even divine patience had its limits, and the time had come to bring this cosmic drama to its conclusion. The threads of fate were drawing tight, the final scenes were being prepared, and the greatest warrior who had ever lived was about to meet the destiny that had been written for him since birth. The end came, as prophesied, through the agency of Paris and Apollo, cowardice and divine will combining to bring down the mightiest hero of the age. Paris, hiding behind the walls of Troy like the weakling he had always been, drew his bow and sent an arrow flying toward the Greek lines. By itself, the shot would have been nothing, the kind of random missile that warriors face every day in battle. But this arrow was guided by Apollo's invisible hand, directed with supernatural precision toward the one spot where even Achilles was vulnerable. The arrow struck him in the heel, the only part of his body that had not been dipped in the waters of the river Styx, the one place where his divine protection did not extend. It was a tiny wound, almost insignificant in appearance, but it carried with it the poison of fate, the certainty of death that no amount of heroism could overcome. Achilles fell, and with him fell the last hope of the Greek army for a quick victory. But even in death, Achilles was not finished with the war. His body became the center of the most ferocious battle of the entire conflict, as Greeks and Trojans alike fought desperately to claim the corpse of the greatest warrior who had ever lived. Ajax and Odysseus led the Greek effort to recover their champion's body, while Hector's brothers and Paris himself tried to drag the corpse into Troy as the ultimate trophy. The battle raged for hours, with heroes falling on both sides as they struggled for possession of Achilles' remains. Finally, the Greeks managed to carry their champion back to their camp, but the cost had been enormous. Some of their greatest warriors had died in the effort, and the army that had once seemed invincible was now broken and demoralized. The funeral of Achilles was an event that matched his importance to the Greek cause. For 17 days, the armies observed a truce, while the greatest warrior who had ever lived was honored with ceremonies fit for a god. His mother Thetis rose from the depths of the sea to mourn her son, bringing with her the daughters of the ocean to sing his funeral song. The muses themselves composed the laments that echoed across the plain of Troy, and even the gods wept for the hero they had helped create and ultimately destroy. But the death of Achilles did more than just remove the Greeks' greatest weapon. It fundamentally changed the nature of the war itself. With the ultimate warrior gone, the conflict could no longer be decided by individual heroism or supernatural prowess. The time of heroes was ending, and the time of strategy, cunning, and technological innovation was beginning. It was Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, whose greatest weapons were his mind and his silver tongue, who would ultimately find the key to Troy's destruction. But his solution would not involve the kind of glorious combat that had characterized the war thus far. Instead, it would require deception, treachery, and the violation of every principle of honorable warfare. The gods had wanted to see how far mortals would go in pursuit of victory. They were about to find out. With Achilles dead and buried, the Greek army found itself in an impossible position. They had been besieging Troy for 10 years, had lost their greatest warrior, and were no closer to victory than they had been on the day they first landed on the Trojan shore. The walls of the city remained unbreached, the defenders still held their positions, and winter was approaching with the promise of another year of stalemate and suffering. Some of the Greek leaders began to speak openly of abandoning the siege and returning home. They had done their duty, they argued, had fought honorably for a decade, had avenged their fallen comrades as much as was humanly possible. Helen could remain in Troy if she chose. The cost of recovering her had already exceeded any reasonable price, but others, led by Agamemnon and Menelaus, refused to consider retreat. Too much blood had been spilled, too many heroes had died, too much honor was at stake to simply sail away and admit defeat. It was in this climate of desperation and division that Odysseus proposed his most audacious plan: the construction of a wooden horse so large that it could hide an entire company of Greek warriors inside its hollow belly. The horse would be presented to the Trojans as a gift, a peace offering from the defeated Greeks who were supposedly abandoning their siege and returning home. Once the horse was inside the city walls, the hidden warriors would emerge under cover of darkness, open the gates of Troy, and allow the rest of the Greek army to pour into the city. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity and breathtaking in its audacity. It relied not on military might or individual heroism, but on the most fundamental of human weaknesses: curiosity, greed, and the desire to believe that victory had finally been achieved. The Greeks would abandon their greatest strength, their reputation for straightforward combat, and instead embrace deception and treachery as tools of war.